For nearly 1,000 days, Ukraine has resisted full-scale Russian aggression. The heroism of its armed forces and its people stands an example to all free nations. But as the US has delivered Trump back to the White House, Ukraine and its allies face mounting strategic dangers. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Benjamin Tallis, director of the Democratic Strategy Initiative, a Berlin think tank set up to address the systemic competition that we now see emerging in global politics. He is formerly a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and he ran the project action group Zeitenwende on the transformation of Germany's security and foreign policy. He's also been the exemplary host of Berlin Inside Out, an absolutely fantastic podcast, which he assures me is returning in 2025. Well, I could read out numerous other sort of accolades and skills there, but I'll pop those into the description of the video. And let's jump into what is an incredibly important topic of Ukraine, European security in the light of a result which I think most of us hoped would not transpire. Ben, welcome back.
Jonathan, a pleasure to be here. And I should really add a line to my CV. Third time guest on Silicon Curtain. I mean, this is profile now.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me back.
No, it's always a pleasure because I find we're able to build on what was said before, and we try not to sort of repeat questions. We try not to cover the same ground, so it becomes much richer experience. More often we get to speak, and I'm delighted you'd honour us with your presence. And it also, not only do we have Trump re-elected, which of course we'll come to, we have the long predicted demise of the German government, but it seems that it's not going to be going quite as fast, perhaps, as it ought to. I mean, it's long past its sell-by date, but it seems that that Schulz cabinet's going to be sticking around at the back of the fridge until March next year. What on earth is going on?
Yes, zombies are notoriously difficult to kill. And this is what we've seen with the death that wasn't quite yesterday with Olaf Schulz, the German Chancellor, dismissing his finance minister from former coalition party partner, the Free Democrats, the FDP, the Liberal Party in Germany, and with a couple of hours later, that party withdrawing all of their ministers from the government. So rather than calling what in anywhere else would be a snap election, the elections are going to be set for March. And that's on the back of a confidence vote that's scheduled to be held in the Bundestag on the 15th of January, so just before Donald Trump's inauguration. And it seems as though the reason for that is party politics. The SPD, Olaf Scholz's party, are banking on getting a good result in the Hamburg state elections that are coming up on the 2nd of March and hope to use that as a tailwind going into an election, a federal election that could be held on the 9th of March. And I would say good luck with that, because a small boost in Hamburg, which is a naturally SPD state, an almost guaranteed SPD state, will not change the overall picture. But what it means is that we have a minority government made up of the SPD and the Greens, with probably some support on certain issues from the CDU, the main opposition party, the Conservative Christian Democrats. And that actually might be reasonably good news for Ukraine in the short term. And it might be reasonably good news for defense spending in the short term, because it has been, to a significant extent, the Free Democrats, who, while in rhetoric have been very supportive of Ukraine, in fiscal matters have been masochistic to a fault. And they have really been holding to this fiscal straitjacket, the debt brake that they helped put Germany in. And that has been one of the key stumbling blocks of coalition politics. It's been one of the key stumbling blocks of actually getting the money forward for Ukraine and for German defense. So it will be interesting to see what the minority government does, what they're able to do with potential support of Christian Democrats in the next 2 months. It probably won't be that much, but it also won't be nothing, I should imagine. Now, part of that depends also on the Christian Democrats, how much they're willing to play ball. And part of their brand is that they seek to serve the national interest rather than just party politics. So we're hoping that they live up to that. And moreover, this is something to encourage a lot of Silicon Curtain viewers. Several of their key figures, including their leader, Friedrich Merz, have made positive statements about Ukraine's victory of late and about Ukraine's NATO membership of late. So we'll wait and see, but we'll be here in Berlin keeping them honest.
So, if I've got that correct, it seems that the election is delayed at a point of absolutely critical European security. The election is delayed for a purely self-interested domestic political advantage, not just an advantage to the German state, in fact, not an advantage to the German state, a highly biased advantage to Scholz individually and to his minority party.
That's certainly the read that's being put on it by a lot of people here in Berlin. If we were to take the counter view, just to sharpen the argument, let's say, then one could say that the Greens may have extracted a price for this from Scholz, and it'll be interesting to see what that price is. Is it indeed more defense spending, or is it something for Ukraine, which they have also been very strong on supporting? Is that the price of allowing Scholz to play his quite petty partisan game and to extend the deadline till that time? Let's see. The proof of the pudding there will be in the eating. The Greens haven't been the most effective at actually working the coalition dynamic in their favor, but maybe now with just two players, they can do it. But overall, your read is right. This is not about national interest on the part of the SPD.
And how important is it that this vote will take place and potentially the government will change prior to Trump acceding to office?
The vote of confidence will take place 15th of January, so about a week before the inauguration. All that will likely do is confirm the dissolution of the government. That's what's basically been agreed on by Robert Habeck of the Greens, the Vice Chancellor, and Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, last night. Then with the election actually not coming until March, we won't see a government before the summer, would be my guess, which it's a bit of a tragedy, really, to continue working at this terribly slow pace. And one of the most frustrating aspects of working here in Berlin over the last few years has been the inability of German decision makers to adjust to the fact that the world doesn't move at the speed of German decision making or institutional process. And unfortunately, this is yet more grist to that mill.
One of the big worries, and of course, if we look at a lot of the media coverage around Ukraine, obviously there is not as much media coverage as there deserves to be, and it doesn't necessarily focus on the things that we perhaps would agree it should focus on. Of course, a lot of the focus is on the incremental losses of Ukrainian territory. Never mind that in an attritional strategy, you trade land in order to attrit your opponent, and that's clearly happening. The media does not really seem to sort of understand that dynamic. But clearly, there are also problems as well with Ukrainian forces in terms of, tiredness and so on. So you've got that. But the Russian economy is busy imploding in a quite spectacular manner. And that seems to get barely any coverage at all. Yes, there are a few YouTubers who make it their business to sort of focus on this. The diaspora Russian opposition will tend to exaggerate this or put a strong focus on that, of course, because it's in their self-interest. But what's your reading of this? Should we be, and can we, in fact, put greater emphasis on throttling the Russian economy and seeking to end Putin's aggression that way, as opposed to the constant agonizing about, whether we have capacity to provide, this armament and that armament at the correct scale and in a timely fashion?
Absolutely. We have the capacity to beat Russia. It is firmly within our ability to do it if we chose to. And that's not only in terms of providing particular equipment to Ukraine, particular military capabilities. It's in terms of building up our defense industrial base and also supporting Ukraine's defense industrial base to build the capacities they need now and in the medium to long term to act as a deterrent. So this is largely a question of will, which is what has been lacking. Will and imagination, perhaps. That's why we do the work that we do, because we think that strategy and leadership are actually what provides the immaterial infrastructure of courage and will, if you like. And so trying to escape this trap, this self-fulfilling trap of fatalism that we see, it's very odd to see so many European decision makers taking a strange kind of comfort in a fatalistic view that Russia is destined to win and that there's almost nothing we can do. What it actually is a lack of courage and a disavowal of responsibility to national and to European security, because the only way to secure Europe is to have a secure Ukraine. Otherwise, we face a really destabilizing geopolitical gray zone right in the heart of Europe. And I think what you're really right to point to is Russia's having lots of problems. The Russians perpetuate this myth, which far too many people around Europe buy into, of their own invincibility and the inevitability of their victory. But, but if you look at some of the key kit that they need for continuing to fight the war the way they choose to fight the war, which is totally disregarding the human cost of it, of course, but very artillery heavy, very heavy in terms of attrition rate, as you mentioned, of not only people, but also of armored vehicles. So looking at artillery and heavy tank barrels, for example, they only have two rotary forges, which can produce, all being well and no duds being produced, 10 each per month. So that's 20 barrels. They are losing about 260 barrels a month. That's to attrition from Ukrainian forces, but also to the wear and tear that artillery barrels and long cannon barrels take during heavy firing. So they're currently been drawing from stocks. They've been taking barrels from old vehicles and so on, but those will run out in 2025, according to the estimates that we work with. Similar story for tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Now, Russia does produce a lot of these, but it's using a huge amount in Ukraine. And that balance between what it can replace and what it can build is also going to run into trouble in terms of the machine tools available in their factories, which are being run to capacity at the moment and which will break eventually, but also because they have drawn down almost all the stockpiles that they can use. And those will again run out in 2025. And to hammer this point home, this is why the worst thing we can do for European security is to acquiesce to some kind of deal that would be imposed on Ukraine, which would freeze the fighting. What that would do would be to allow Russia to then build up its capacity without losing capacity to the attrition of fighting and of daily use of this equipment. So we would give Russia the chance to reconstitute its forces, to have another go at Ukraine, and to have a go at us potentially later. And there is no reason for us to believe that Russia would keep to any deal that was struck.
And on the financial side, of course, it's incredibly important. Now, there have been some moves to make the interest on frozen Russian central bank assets available to Ukraine. Is now the time, and in fact, is this at all realistic? Is it now the time to actually take that entire amount and translate it into the financial liquidity that the Ukrainian government needs to pay wages, keep its infrastructure going, but also translate that into the badly needed armaments?
Well, yeah, I mean, the best time to do that would have been 2 years ago and more, but the second best time is tomorrow to do that. So yes, we should be doing that. This would send a significant signal of our resolve, of our will to win, of our will to do what is necessary and what is actually perfectly within international law under the provision of countermeasures to do. It's actually a step that would help protect international law in future, and that the false equivalence that is drawn by, I've heard it actually from here, from officials in the German Foreign Office even, talking about how seizing Russian assets would make us as bad as the Russians. Well, no, it really wouldn't. Launching a genocidal imperial invasion of your neighbor and slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people is not the same as seizing assets, which you actually can do within the law. Now, it's interesting to note that the US passed legislation on this. Canada has legislation backed up, but the vast majority of those assets are held by European countries. And it is us that are most directly at risk of future Russian aggression. So we would actually have the greatest incentive to establish this principle of financial deterrence and to hit Russia right in the wallet, where it really hurts and where it would provide a significant difference to Kiev. Unfortunately, I don't yet see that movement taking place in Berlin. I don't see it necessarily taking place in Paris, which are the two key decision-making centers on this. And which have been the two key stumbling points so far. But I do see that there could be a pressure now after the Trump election to find other ways to do more and to find what we can do. So we're going to be firmly pushing that agenda. We have the arguments, we have the evidence for that. Economically, it's feasible. Legally, it's feasible. It's a question of political will.
Well, let's turn to the incredible signatures you've got for a paper that you recently produced. Some of the most respected names in the field, and of course, many people I recognize as being, let's say, on the what some describe as the hawkish side. I think what we've described as the realistic side, which is not falling into the trap of Russia, the inevitable Russian victory and this kind of stuff. But essentially, you point out that to freeze the lines of contact now, to give Putin a victory, would be to initiate another Munich, a second Munich. And of course, we know the dire consequences of the first Munich, which essentially led to the terrible conflagration of the Second World War, the total annulment of the power of deterrent, which gave Hitler free rein to start his conquests in Europe. What was your motivations behind the paper, and what impact has it had so far?
Well, the motivation was clear. It was ahead of the US election. It was to ask Europeans in particular not to become complacent about hoping, as they many did, for a Harris result, saying that this would potentially impose costs on Ukraine and be to the detriment of our security, because there was every suspicion that Harris's team would have continued basically the Biden stance, which is failing and has been a policy that fails Ukraine and fails Europe. Now, Europeans have failed Europe too. We should be very, very clear about that. Our policy hasn't been strong enough to step up. And so it was a call to arms, an appeal of urgency to say we can't afford more of the same. The other side of it was to say, should Donald Trump get elected, we don't know what's going to happen. It's a much less predictable affair with Trump. It may be that we end up with an administration stuffed with Reagan Republicans who are of the we win, they lose mentality and who would love to see more peace through strength. It may be the exact opposite. It may be we see the administration full of people who are willing to cave to Russia, who pursue a narrow, short-sightedly America first policy to the actual detriment of America's interest long term. We don't know, but there is a risk that Trump could try and impose a deal on Ukraine. He's said this in the past. He will end the conflict quickly. And we don't know what he plans to do for that. But the suspicion is it would be about imposing a deal on Ukraine that is actually to the detriment of Ukraine and to European security. And so what we argued, together with what you're right to say was a stellar cast of supporters, we were delighted by the response this got from them, um, was to say that in either case, this has a parallel with the Munich Agreement of 1938, where famously Neville Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister sold Czechoslovakia down the river, acquiesced to the dismembering of a sovereign state within Europe, rewarded an aggressor who went on, emboldened, to be far more aggressive and to wreak destruction across Europe, and didn't even really buy ourselves time to rearm. So this was a disastrous deal. Should be the object lesson of history to be able to say, do not do this again. And yet here we are standing before the precipice of repeating that mistake. Now, academic historians will quibble about whether this Munich is actually the Munich we think it is, or whether you can ever have a Munich 2. That's not really the point here. There is a lesson to learn, and it's a lesson that we are in danger of not applying. And so that's why we launched this appeal. And one of the key aspects of this was to say, we can still turn this around. There is time. And that was based on five key grounds. So one is that what we discussed a second ago, Russian victory is not inevitable. The myth of Russian invincibility needs to be punctured. The second is that there's no credible plan for Ukraine or for European security if we do strike a deal. Putin can't be trusted. Why should we think they will stick to that deal? And there's no suggestion at the moment of credible security guarantees being provided to Ukraine. Here in Berlin, there's still opposition, even from supposedly pro-Ukraine politicians in some cases, of Ukraine's NATO membership. So we're left with a vacuum there, which would really leave us in trouble, especially as we haven't kicked our own industrial production into gear. So it gives Russia that time to rearm and puts us in danger. The third is that, again, this endangers all European allies. I mean, Minsk 3 or Munich 2, however we'd call it, would signal our weakness. It would signal our lack of resolve. And it would really, I think, encourage a further attack in future, or the Putin dream, which is to win and subjugate Europe without firing a shot because we go politically soft. Fourth point was that a route to Ukrainian victory still exists. And this is key because we speak to a lot of the leading military experts who work with new military technologies and who understand what we could do to actually build Ukraine a strategic strike force, to actually make sure that they would have the capability to disable Russia's war machine and prevent it fighting in the way that it can fight. So this is about saying we can do something if we want to, but for that, we need a coalition of the willing to actually target their support around a clear theory of victory. And that's the fifth and final point, is that those who want to act can. They don't need to wait for NATO. And this is a point I made somewhat controversially on Twitter yesterday, is that unity is overrated. If it's unity around the position of Berlin rather than the position of Tallinn, we're in trouble. Lowest common denominator is not sufficient for the time being. So what we need is that coalition of the willing to go ahead, to change facts on the ground and change policy. And if they do, others will follow.
And this is a really interesting point, which I was sort of discussing yesterday or touched upon. And this is the idea that actually we're moving to an era where something like the British-led Joint Expeditionary Force could be not just, a future replacement for NATO, but it's essential to move to smaller units that are willing to take action, smaller units that are not governed by bureaucracy, consensus thinking, long time scales, but reliant on not just taking action, but investing in making that action possible.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's how NATO started, of course, before it got rather bloated and atrophied, let's say. There's a wonderful story that former NATO Secretary General was asked how many people work at NATO, and he said about half. And that's just rather indicative of a long-time problem with NATO. The other big problem with NATO is we allowed it to become a protectorate, an American protectorate, rather than a true alliance. And so, yes, using smaller formats where there is trust, where there is good faith, where all the participants are indeed willing, is seen to be a way forward as part of minilateralism or flexilateralism, as it's called. Now, there was a very prescient paper last year from the German Council on Foreign Relations, I'll let you look that one up, that argued that indeed the GEF might provide a bridge to NATO for Ukraine. And as there's all now NATO members involved, there's one of NATO's nuclear powers. There are many of Ukraine's strongest supporters involved in the GEF. This is something that would, by extending the GEF to Ukraine, make a significant difference and would provide a meaningful security guarantee while not being an alternative to NATO membership, which is still better overall. Now, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any movement among the leading GEF countries in the UK in particular to that effect. It's something that is continuing to be suggested, but there are several issues blocking it. One is that the UK rather likes the GEF how it is, with them being the unchallenged leader of that. Second is that other countries in GEF like that it works and don't want to destabilize it. But at the same time, the situation now is so urgent and so apparent that we have to do something, that there does need to be a bit more imaginative thinking there. And one proposal is also to include Poland in GEF as Europe's defense leader, while still being excluded from a lot of the top table talks in NATO. So I think we do have to get creative about that. And this is why also it was so good to see some of the signatories that you alluded to earlier sign this. I mean, we've got world-leading strategists, so Hugh Strawn, Elliot Cohen, former CIA Director General Michael Hayden, as well as a host of other former intelligence officers. We've got flag rank of officers from the US, David Deptula, the Airman's Airman, America's Airman, if you like, a revolutionary in air power thinking, signed up to this. Mick Ryan, who many of you know and who's been on Silicon Curtain, Edward Stringer and Greg Bagwell, who are two former air marshals from the Royal Air Force, Didier Piaton of the French Navy. And then there's a raft of senior politicians. So former UK Deputy PM David Liddington, who chairs Rusi, Chris Alexander from the Canadian government, Thomas Ilves, known to many Silicon Curtain viewers as well. And we managed to bring in as well 8 German MPs, senators from the Czech Republic and Canada. And then there's a host of other experts as well. So it was really great to see them take up this cause. And boy, did that help it get a reception. This has been on the BBC. It's been on TVP, Polish television. It's been the subject of interviews with some of the signatories in Sweden, in Denmark, here in Germany, and in the UK. So it's really made an impact. And I know I had several messages from government ministers as well as ambassadors around Europe, former government ministers, all saying how necessary this initiative was and how much they appreciate it. So our challenge now is to use that as a platform and boost it on to the next step to build this coalition of the willing.
And it's interesting, isn't it? We'll come on to Putin's assumptions behind his war strategy. Maybe strategy is too big a word for that. I mean, there seems to be a lot of opportunism in how he behaves. We'll come on to that in a second. But from someone on the outside of both academia and these political institutions, it seems to me that we have now a kind of creme brulee, which is a kind of hard crust of the sort of Jeff type nations that could potentially put up some kind of resistance to Russian aggression, whether it be hybrid or direct hot warfare. But behind them, you have the soft, gooey stuff that will put up no resistance. Austria, Hungary, Serbia, Slovakia, and it forms this sort of gooey layer behind the hard crust. How worrying is it that our institutions that rely on consensus decision making actually contain many states that some of us believe are partially or almost fully captured by Russian influence?
Yeah, it's hugely worrying. I mean, I think I would actually probably add an additional layer to your creme brulee, which I like very much. I think there's a layer of rot and mold at the bottom, which is those ones you just mentioned, which are actively eating away at the good substance. But the blancmange in the middle, the good, the soft stuff, once you crack through the shell, that's unfortunately most of the major European powers. And so while we've got the hard crust of the NCEE, the Nordics, Baltics, Poland, the Czechs for now, let's assume that they continue to hold the course, although there's an election there next year that might change things there. Um, the Netherlands to a certain extent as well, and the UK in and out, even if it's lost the leadership position it had earlier in the full-scale war. But still with Germany, still with France, still with Italy and Spain, certainly there is no sense that they would actually really stand up. The France's rhetoric from President Macron has been terrific over the last year after a very welcome volte-face from him. But there's not a stable political base at home, and there's not seemingly money behind the promise that would actually make a significant material difference. And I think that bluff has been called a little bit, and we haven't seen the substance behind it. In Germany, I mean, this is something I talk about a lot. The failed Zeitenwende, for all the progress that has been made, is not enough to meet the geopolitical moment. It's not moving at the speed of relevance. It's not actually the substance that is there. And the big geopolitical shift hasn't happened. And there are serious worries among many allies as to whether Germany would actually stand up and be counted in the event of an Article 5 situation. So I think that's the middle of your creme brulee, with the rot at the bottom that's slowly eating up, and the soft center, which is the real problem there. So because these things are a battle of capabilities, but also a battle of will and a battle of resolve, that positioning is really hurting us. And as you mentioned, it's also hurting us because of consensus decision making in key institutions. And it's up to us now to get our ship in order.
And with the incoming president, all it would take is just a hint from Trump and a hint from the German government that they would not necessarily immediately react to an infringement of Article 5. NATO is done. And all this conversation about Ukraine joining NATO may be entirely defunct. They're joining something that no longer has teeth, no longer has deterrence power, but is still engorged by a sense of its own self-importance, which prevents other more agile organizations from emerging from that wreckage. Is this too harsh a picture, or is this the time to be hyper realistic and critical?
It's a really interesting question. From where I'm sitting, NATO is still the best we've got because it's tried and tested, mainly coasting on legacy, to be honest, from the Cold War, when we really knew how to run an alliance. And if we want to make good on that legacy, rather than just celebrating 70 years for the sake of 70 years and the world's longest lasting defense alliance, etc., 75 years, it has to recover its mojo. It has to actually renew itself properly. And part of that, what made it successful in the Cold War, was the understanding very clearly that actually, although founded on a military platform, it was actually an alliance of political psychology. It was actually to prevent individual states caving into domestic pressure at times on defense spending or caving into the threats that the Kremlin was going to make against them, which is how they were trying to go about it. The Russians were trying to go about this by picking off individual European countries. And if you were to try and face that and stand up on your own, you wouldn't have a chance. So strength in numbers, strength in the alliance itself was the key. But that also meant high-level peer pressure as well as collective spine stiffening. It meant pushing others around and saying, hey, you're not doing your part. You're not spending enough. You need to do that. Or basically, you're in trouble here. And we've lost that art actually of pushing people around. And it needs to be recovered. And I suspect there are certain NATO countries looking in Warsaw's direction that would be quite comfortable taking that role. And we need them to do it. So is NATO bust? Not yet. Can we save it? Yes. Even if we don't save NATO as such, there will need to be a European version of that. And building a European pillar of NATO based on capabilities is the best way to prepare for that. It's also the best way to actually save the alliance by being better allies. So I think we can do one thing that would actually continue to help us in any circumstance. But you are right to say that there's a huge threat to NATO from that Article 5 commitment, which is not binding in a particular response. It allows that response to be decided by each country. And while Donald Trump wouldn't be able to withdraw the US from NATO, he can undermine Article 5. as could others. So given that's the case, we do need to think about the alternative arrangements, but I wouldn't write NATO off yet, as it is, if we get it going again, is still the best bet.
And of course, we can come onto hybrid threats in a minute because Russia may test Europe in ways that don't automatically trigger Article 5, or at least a harsh interpretation would say they do, and a appeasing interpretation would say they don't. So we'll come on to that in a minute. But it seems to me that Russia's invasion is based on four assumptions, three of which are proven to be correct, unfortunately, and one which is not. And those still hold 3 years into the war, which means that Putin still has a sense of victory and is not necessarily planning to dismantle his special military operation. So the assumption that didn't work out was that Ukraine would fight back. And I think he was surprised at that. And that has obviously led to the now genocidal policy, because he realizes that Ukrainians cannot be good little Russians. The three other assumptions, however, hold. One is that the West would not put boots on the ground, not intervene directly to push him back. This harks back to Munich as well. The second one is that our institutions would be bureaucratic, sclerotic, and slow in making decisions. And he's absolutely proven right on that. And the third one, and this is perhaps the most cynic of all, is that through Nord Stream, and that didn't quite work out, but through various tools and mechanisms, he could divide and conquer and buy off certain allies to weaken. It seems to me that those three assumptions have proved correct. That is why he is continuing to fight. And we have done nothing to disabuse him of those three, nothing to overturn or show that they no longer hold.
The no boots on the ground thing and automatically discussing what our red lines are and what we won't do has been a huge strategic error, not just an error of communication. It's something that baffles military experts when you talk to them. And imagine playing a game of rugby and saying, you know what, we won't try and get behind the try line from the left. No tries on the left, guys, today. All right, just so you know. I mean, it makes it a bit easier to defend against, and this is a huge problem. In terms of bureaucracy and sclerosis, I don't know actually if I would agree with that completely, because I think at moments we have moved incredibly fast. And so Ursula von der Leyen saying that Ukraine is one of us and belongs to us was a lightning change in 2 decades of policy on Ukraine. Now, what you could argue is that it hasn't been properly followed up. Now we see the bureaucracy behind that slowing everything down. I think you could say that there. But what it does show is where there is political will, where there is leadership, and where there is strategic vision, there can be a way found to actually change the game. And what we've seen is what's gone from being impossible has gone to being inevitable on Ukrainian EU membership, on supplying weapons itself, which was for Berlin and others not going to happen. Is it enough? No, of course it's not. And I think the real key issue of what you're saying is that fourth point, which is about division and about the fact that so many European countries still haven't understood this is their war too, and haven't understood that it is our security that is fundamentally in question here. And that comes across many fronts. And you can see Russia and China working together. You can see Russia and Iran working together. You can see the axis of evil, circle of jerks, whatever you want to call them, really doing this together. And so dividing the EU on, for example, subsidies on or tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, where they were very easily able to buy off Spain with a promise of a 1 billion hydration plant. I mean, wow, if we can't compete with that, and if that was a competitive offer, we have one problem. Also, wow, how dare they take that and undermine the rest of us? How dare does Germany do that? And again, why aren't we actually standing up for our interests there? And so I think Russia does see a potentially dividable Europe on this, and we've fostered that impression. But again, this is why the crust of the creme brulee, the hard edge, the steel arc, if you like, of Northeast Central Europe has to really stand up and do what they need to do. Forget waiting for the others. Go forward, change the facts on the ground, borrow the money if you need to. I mean, Germany should be putting up that money. It's the one country in Europe that tomorrow could borrow 500 billion and not make too much of a difference to itself. It's not doing it for now, but you do it. Create a Jeff Bank, create a coalition of the willing funders of new military technology in the European Union. And this is something I'd like to see a lot more from the new defense commissioner coming in, is those kind of creative and flexible approaches to coalitions of the willing that show, yes, you might divide us, but at our strongest, you won't have a chance to beat us.
That's incredibly important. And another project which we're launching on the channel is to put together a list of things that would contribute towards a victory. This has been one of the challenges, though, hasn't it? Not only is there no clear conception of victory amongst most of the European allies, it's not articulated. I rather suspect that it doesn't really exist, or it's fragmented to the point where you cannot have a consistent plan. The US and Berlin actively don't want Russia to lose. I think we've got to be clear about that. It's become fairly obvious that they are terrified of the so-called nuclear chaos that would come out of a fragmenting Russia. My own experience of Russia and its history tells me that that is a coercive technique to control our behavior rather than something that necessarily would come to pass in reality. But that's one of the problems, not just not having a concept of victory, but having no clear concept of the kind of Ukraine and Europe that would emerge after that, the security architecture that we need long term, and indeed the kind of Russia that we eventually want to see. It's all very well criticizing Putin and this and that, and he's such a monster, but we have not articulated
Mhm.
the kind of Russia we want to see emerge and how indeed that can emerge. And unfortunately, most of the Russian diaspora and opposition have also not articulated how you get from here to there either. So this is a really big problem.
It is. And I think you've put your finger on what is the key issue behind all of this, which is our lack of strategic capability and our true lack of strategic analysis, strategic policy development, and strategic implementation, as well as strategic leadership, which, of course, is why we set up the Democratic Strategy Initiative in Berlin to precisely address Germany and its allies' strategic deficits, to build the strategic capacity and foster the strategic culture that we need to be able to make those kind of changes. And it's a remarkable thing to me. I mean, sometimes you talk to officials here and you talk about a theory of victory and say, oh, no, we don't do that. What do you mean you don't do that? How dare you? This is an absolute disavowal of responsibility. And it comes together with a highly risk-averse culture, a highly pain-averse culture, terror of making mistakes, terror of sticking your head out and taking a risk, terror of getting something wrong because that gets absolutely jumped on. And I mean, you don't have to talk to a management consultant to know this is not going to run your business well. It's not going to run your country well or your culture well either. And it's precisely what is letting us down at the moment. So I think it's interesting to note that's not just in Germany. There's a wider problem there. We could see, I mean, Julian Linley French's new book, The Retreat from Strategy in the UK, Keir Giles's book that has Who Will Defend Europe, when it very clearly doesn't look like it would be able to be the UK. Now, what the UK had in the early part of the full-scale war was an instinct. And it had a leader who went with instinct. And so for all the bad sides of Boris Johnson, which would fill another episode of Silicon Curtain, there was that instinct to do this. And whether that was self-preservation, political instinct, riding the wave, or sticking up for the underdog, sticking up for European security and European order, it was there and it kicked in. But the lack of strategic depth behind that has been exposed in the last year in particular. And I don't think the new Labour government has yet shown that they're trying to get that back in a serious way. So we have to have, as you said, a clear vision of what we want for European security and for our own societies to be able to outcompete Russia in a serious way. And then we have to have a strategy to actually achieve that. And strategy is not actually that difficult. It's about saying, look, here's a challenge we have to overcome in order to get to that objective, that vision that we have. Here is the crux of that challenge. So you do a diagnosis about what is stopping you from doing it, and then you come up with a guiding policy and some coherent actions to follow it through. And from that, you then assign resources and then you follow up on implementing it. So this is not beyond our wit and will to be able to do. And that's what we're trying to work with decision makers to do, because strategy will get us there. But at the moment, we don't have it.
I noticed something extraordinary about Boris Johnson that normally when he speaks on a topic that he, pretends to be an expert on or is trying to pull the wool over your eyes, there's an extraordinary amount of fluffy language, which if you parse it, makes about as much sense as one of Trump's speeches. But when he talks about Ukraine, he talks in short, clipped, precise sentences. So I think there's an interesting point there. I think he probably does genuinely there align a thought process with instinct, and that works. So, despite everything you've said, I'd be really keen to have him on the channel to sort of talk
Oh
about
yeah.
that because I think that instinct is actually rather strong. Well, there's two topics to that I wanted to sort of touch upon still. Um, we'll come to the grey zone one last, but let's touch upon all these things that we've talked about. If the Allies were not to take this warning about Munich too seriously, and if they were to move forward and try and impose territorial concessions, and if that demand of neutrality, now we may say that we don't support neutrality, but unless Ukraine is brought rapidly into NATO, we are de facto creating a form of neutrality for it. What are the risks of those two things coming to pass?
Well, I mean, you're right. This would be de facto neutrality, and it would be an almost guaranteed disaster because it creates a pressure point. It creates a constant hold that Vladimir Putin would have over pain-averse and risk-averse European leaders to say, do what I want, or I'm going into Ukraine again, or do what I want, or I'm coming for you next time. And the danger of us caving to that, if we've already caved on Ukraine, is significant. I mean, there will be countries who don't, and it's important to note there are countries that do have clear strategy and good leadership, and those are that arc of countries that we mentioned before. So from the Baltics through Poland and certain parts of the leadership in Brussels as well, around von der Leyen and others. Kaya Kallas now there, of course, as well. So they won't fold, but others would, and that would make it so much more difficult for us to hold out. So that is an enormous danger that we would face. We basically invite aggression or invite coercion and bullying on the presumption that we would fold. So this is why a strategy of weakness will never work. And it's unfortunately the peacemongers are still beating this drum. Give peace a chance. You're not giving peace a chance. What you're giving is coercion a way in. And this I think is a huge danger if we do then impose the freezing of the conflict without proper security guarantees. And as we discussed earlier, that does or should mean NATO in the longer run. It must mean something else in the short run if there's not agreement on NATO. So it must mean that coalition of the willing extending real mutual defense responsibilities to Ukraine, which none of the defense pacts so far have done, simply because there is not the will to do it, which again invites coercion. So I think this is a serious problem that we really have to solve. Otherwise, we put ourselves in danger of subjugation or indeed of attack, because what it would do would create a precedent whereby should Russia then engage in a low-level incursion into one of the Baltic states to test whether others would stand up. If they don't, then the whole game is very quickly up. And that doesn't necessarily mean we would all be invaded quickly, but it would mean we have to subjugate ourselves to Russian control. And that is not an appealing prospect for me or for anyone else who cares about freedom, I think, and cares about the future of our democracy, about how our kids can live and about our future thriving. So that's something we need to be acutely aware of. If we did stand up, but without sufficient force, then we could expect Ukraine war to come to us as well. And there's a false perception among some in Germany and elsewhere that this is something far away, that Russia would quote unquote have to come through Poland and the Baltic states. Well, welcome to the long-range missile strike complex. Yeah, Munich is well in reach. So is Hamburg. So is Berlin. And our air defense is grossly lacking. So we would be subject very quickly here in Germany to that pressure if Germany did stand up at first, and that would create a risk it would fold afterwards. So I think that's a real danger that we have to head off.
And this leads to the last question, I think, because again, this mindset that says, well, this is a war far away, and somehow you can sort of, you can extinguish the flames and everyone can move on and go back to normal, whatever that is. Isn't it quite clear that Russia has moved far beyond the international rules-based order, and in fact is rather keen to tear that down, and the internal lawlessness, which was always there, that is now morphed from being a sort of domestic way of doing business to how they do their external business as well. They've moved entirely to these so-called informal power relations, aka sort of mafia type techniques. When you combine that with their hybrid informational aggression, plus their growing capabilities around grey zone aggression, and indeed the outsourcing, the gig economy outsourcing of sabotage, assassination, all these things, isn't it extremely myopic to think that Russian aggression and coercion will recede? Rather, with the end of full-scale hostility in Ukraine, it's much more likely to escalate rapidly.
Yes, because they see it works and nothing succeeds like success. So they would see that as a win and would carry on. It would embolden them, as we said, to continue to double down on all of those tactics in their arsenal. The one thing I wonder where they reach their limit on that is not only where we push back on it properly, which is the proper way to end this, but also in their relationship with China. Because if we're talking about informal power relations, then there's one clearly very bigger player in that relationship. And as China builds its nuclear arsenal, the one thing that Russia had over it is no longer going to be valid. And so Russia and China are very different kinds of actors. Russia, I think, as you very well described, is a disordering actor. It's about tearing stuff down. It's the Joker in Batman. Some just love to watch the world burn because then they can profit off the chaos. The Well, China is different. China is an ordering power. China wants to make the world in its image, or at least conducive to its interests. And at some point, Russia is useful in that because it's tearing down or helping to tear down the old order. But when it comes for the time to China to replace that, what competitive advantage does Russia have in a Chinese ordered world? What screw do they get out of this? How are they allowed to behave and how are they not? And that would be a very interesting limit to their alliance of convenience, which I think is very much there. They're coordinating action, that's clear, but there are limits to that. So I think we have an incentive to get in there ahead of this, of course, because that would take a long time to reach those limits. And we have to stand up to the grey zone aggression that you mentioned. This is something that people in the Baltic states, experts, but also politicians that I talk to, cannot understand why Germany in particular is not standing up to the destabilization activity on our soil right here. We're talking arson attacks, we're talking extrajudicial killings, we're talking subversion of all kinds, disinformation on a massive scale. And this is well known to the German services. It's not being acted on by the government. And so one of our missions here as part of DSI is to actually bring that to strategic attention and come up with a strategic plan for addressing that. One last thing I'd like to mention, Jonathan, as we are talking about this in the light of Trump 2, day one, let's say, is we are all worried, of course, about what is going to happen to NATO, as we said before, what is going to happen to the US security commitment in Europe and how that might leave us exposed. But it's extremely important to emphasize that for 75 years, it has been the US that has guaranteed European security. We have dropped the ball massively in Europe on actually providing for our own security, not evenly, as we said. So Poland, Baltic states standing up very well, showing how it's done. But we nonetheless still have a relationship with the United States of America, its institutions and its people, regardless of who is the president. Now, a particular president, and it may be Trump, may make that much more difficult for us to continue to have a productive relationship. But to the extent that we can, we should still try and work with the US and should still try and actually be good allies to the US because we have much more in common there than we do with Russia, China, or the others who are trying to collectively destabilize our democracies.
And China is a topic we're going to be covering a lot more on the channel. It seems that in trying to curtail Russian activity, we would be remiss if we didn't try to put some pressure on China, in fact. And this is maybe where Trump might be useful if we can link the topic of Russia and China in his mind and let him loose on China, then that might provide a little bit of a wake-up call. Well, that's a whole other episode there, so we'll queue that up with other guests to try and cover that off. But for today, I will certainly put a link to the letter that you've written and with your co-signatories. We'll pop a description of that into the video so people can find it and read it, and I'd highly recommend they do that. Also, if they want to follow some of those people who, as you say, are active still on Twitter or X, I think that's really important to get that sort of quality of insight injected into your Twitter stream, not just videos of puppies and kittens and stuff. But for today, Ben, it's been a huge pleasure having you back on the channel. I look forward to the next opportunity to talk again. But for today, thank you so much.
Jonathan, thanks for having me. It's been great to be on, and I know you're suffering with a cold, so gute Besserung, as they would say here in Berlin. Get well soon, and lovely to be back. Hope to be back again soon.